This is awesome. This is a test in concentration here today for the worship team. Thanks for having me back again. I had no hair the last time I was here. Some of you remember I just had it shaved off in honor of Chad. And whoops, lost a diaper. That could be a bad thing. And this is 5 months growth. This is what it normally looks like. So Destiny is our goat keeper, sheep keeper, lamb keeper. And if there's a mess on the floor, she's going to take care of it. No, she's not. Let me read to you this passage from 1 Peter. Am I up here in the background? Do we have slides anywhere? There we go. Yeah. How Chad Haynes got out of town in the face of a tough passage. This is from 1 Peter, the second chapter. Reading from the Message. You who are servants, be good servants to your masters, not just to good masters, but also to bad ones. What counts is that you put up with it for God's sake when you're treated badly for no good reason. There's no particular virtue in accepting punishment that you well deserve. But if you're treated badly for good behavior and continue in spite of it to be a good servant, that is what counts with God. This is the kind of life you've been invited into, the kind of life Christ lived. He suffered everything that came his way so you would know that it could be done, and also know how to do it step by step. Quoting from the scripture, he never did one thing wrong, not once said anything amiss. They called him every name in the book, and he said nothing back. He suffered in silence, content to let good God set things right. He used his servant body to carry our sins to the cross so we could be rid of sin, free to live the right way. His wounds became your healing. You were lost sheep with no idea who you were or where you were going. Now you are named and kept for good by the shepherd of your souls. This passage is in a sequence, I think, with something that Chad has been working through with you in 1 Peter, and it really pivots on this verses 16 and 17, which are just above the passage I just read. Peterson translates it this way: exercise your freedom by serving God, not by breaking the rules. Treat everyone you meet with dignity. Love your spiritual family. Revere God. Respect the government. And so in biblical terms, in scholarship terms, that's called a pivot. It does double duty. It affects what's in front of it, sort of pulls it together, and then it becomes a pivot to the next section, which is the one we're looking at today. And this passage is one that continues to call us to focus on how we live lives in situations which may not be comfortable for us, particularly in the place where we have to give up some of ourselves in order to just exist, or, if Peter is right, in order to draw people towards God by a submissive heart. And so those two verses really are the focal point here, and it sets us up then to think about what happens when we are stuck in a place that we cannot get out of. And so let me describe to you what it was like for servants in the first century, but I don't know if you guys know this quote from, there we go, Martin Luther. Martin Luther said in this Insanity of Christian Faith, and I had a counselor in our church family for a while. He's now living in California. And he described Christianity as the closest thing to insanity that he knew of. I want you to think about that for a moment. To live the Christian life is the closest thing to insanity that we know of. And Luther understood this when he talked about this whole idea of submission and where we are in the realm of freedom. And his quote is this: a Christian is the most free Lord of all and subject to none. A Christian is the most dutiful servant of all and subject to all. That's the tension we live in. All the time we live in that tension. And this sense of freedom that we have given to us by the grace of God comes out and works in the area especially of our lives of service to others. And I think that's sort of where we were when I was here in September, that we talked about living lives of service and working with others, giving ourselves away. in order that Christ might be lifted up and people be drawn to the aroma of Christ in our own lives. And so this passage itself, I want to translate culturally for you. I think you're going to have to do that for me back there. Sorry, there. Whoops, there it goes. There we go. I'm going to let you do that because it's too far out of range here. First century, the word servants here, and in some of your translations may have slaves. It's not the same word. I don't know how much Chad does with, I don't know how much Chad's done with his own Greek, let alone yours. The passage before talks about slaves and uses the word doulos, which is somebody who's really owned completely by a master. This word is a little different. It is a word that really is more like a house servant, almost an indentured servant in American history. You might know that sequence, where you might owe someone money and you were not able to pay it off, and so you would indenture yourself to that person for a period of 6 or 7 years until it was paid off. Very old system. The Jewish people knew about it in the Old Testament period. And so these guys in the first century are something like that. They actually were owned by their masters, and many people in the Greek Mediterranean world had at least one house servant that would be theirs, that would literally belong to them. But it's not the same as the kind of slavery that we experienced in the United States or North America, South America, in the 1800s, 1800s. These slaves had incredible freedom. In fact, the house servants were often actually considered part of the family. They would live with the family. They often had responsibility for the training, for the teaching of the children in the house. Almost like a live-in nanny for the women, and most of them were women. And these servants then actually had some freedom to buy and to open their own businesses. Maybe it was they would sell things that they made by hand. They perhaps were cooks, and they could cook things and sell them in the marketplace. And if they could save enough money, they could literally buy their freedom and be free people. Unfortunately, the life of a free person was not nearly as comfortable as these house servants. And so there's this tension for these house servants to maybe not buy their own freedom, but to stay under the mastership, the ownership of another person. Now that was fine if you had a great master. If you were in a house and your master or your mistress was someone like my wife, and she would take good care of you and feed you every day, and all you had to do was do the dishes afterwards, that's a good place to stay, right? I mean, I'm all up for doing the dishes for free food. That works for me all the time, every day, every night. It's a great place to be. And so these first century servants, they really were in this place where, man, maybe it's better for me just to stay here, especially if they had a good master or mistress. Now, if they didn't, that's when the conflict came. And there were harsh masters, because these servants literally belonged to them as property. Now, there were some restrictions on what was normally allowed in the area of punishment for them. They were limited in how much they could beat them and what they could use to beat them if they had to use that kind of punishment. They were not supposed to withhold any kind of food for them. They were working property, and so they didn't want to really crush them or hurt them. And yet there were harsh masters who, both emotionally and physically, could really destroy these people's lives. And the struggle then becomes, what do I do as a follower of Jesus? I've been set free by the grace of God. In the cross of Jesus, my life is my own, made whole by redemption in the hands of God. So how do I then relate to someone who is maybe a cruel master? What do I do here with this? Do I rebel against them? Or do I just submit and take it? How do I handle this living in tension between the freedom that I have in Christ and being stuck as a servant, belonging to somebody else? Peter has an underlying foundation. We'll go ahead to this next one, yeah. And his underlying foundation is this, that the reason that we would live our lives out well in that kind of a situation is this. It is God's will that by doing good, you might cure the ignorance of the fools who think you're a danger to society. There was in the first century, especially in the middle to second third of the first century, the sense among the Roman and Greek populations that this new group called Christians, or the Way, or the followers of Jesus, they were really about tearing down the foundations of society. They wanted to turn things literally upside down. I mean, if you remember the book of Acts, that's what the accusation against Paul and his buddies was. These men have turned the world upside down. And so there's this great lasting fear in the first century that these Jesus followers were really about ignoring the laws of Caesar. They did crazy things like break the bread and drink the wine in sort of what was described by some Roman writers as a cannibalistic service. And they would meet out in the nighttime, and they were accused of eating their children, eating the flesh and blood of others, which, if you think about the terminology that we use in the first century, or even today, it is the body and blood of Christ that you are about to take if you take the Lord's Supper. And translated for those folks in the first century, this sounded like they were really doing something ritualistic and cannibalistic in their lives. And so there's this deep sense that begins to grow middle of the first century that these Christians were really about wrecking society. And so Peter says, look, in the face of that, here's what this doing good is to cure the ignorance of those fools who take a look at us and don't see that we're not about danger to society, but about redemption of the human life. And Peter uses this as his foundation for taking them forward, which brings us again to this sense of servants, some of them who had good masters and some who didn't. And this tension then between what Peter calls them to do well, do good, so that people will be silenced in this ignorant talk about us tearing down society. They will see that what we bring to them is life itself. And so Peter says, so what do we do with this? What do we do when grace has set us free, but we're really not physically free? So there are two choices, I think. Go to that next slide, if you will. The first is to guys who are in any kind of a servanthood, just to be good servants. And there's no caveat. There's no but if involved here. Peter just says, if you are to be a good servant of Christ, and both Paul and Peter extend this and say, look, serve your masters if you're serving God. That if you're going to do that and do it well, there's no attachment. There's no, if you're treated badly, then you can be a bad servant. He just says straight up, be a good servant. That process then becomes harsh and difficult in the face of a harsh master. The term that is translated bad or wicked here, we have a lady in our church who's an amazing pianist, Tanya Powers, and she's had lifelong scoliosis in her back. That's the word that's used. It means if you have a twisted master, you are still asked to serve him well. It's exactly the same word. If you have a master who is twisted and bent, you are still called to act well in the face of that situation. Peter doesn't offer those servants any choice. But to honor God, to honor Christ, to honor what has been given to you is to work your life as if you have the greatest master of all. And to choose other than that is to dishonor what God would have us be. You don't get to gripe about being punished for bad behavior here, and you don't get to gripe about being punished for good behavior, either way. In other words, there's no griping. I want you to think about that tomorrow when you go back to your job. Okay? How many of you are school teachers? Any school teachers? Oh my goodness. You have a good principal or a bad principal? Yeah, I'm not confessing. No way. You have a good administrative team, bad administrative. You have a good team of teachers that you work with. How about your kids? Are they just joys to be with every day? Now, tomorrow morning they might be, but by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, how are they? Well, you don't get to gripe about that, translated culturally. And so Peter lays this out and says, look, we are here to honor God by living our lives in this place of submission. I want to address that for just a minute. I don't know if Chad talked about this in the passage you looked at last week or not. But submission itself is an act of freedom. I want you to think about that for a minute. This is not being subjected to good behavior. Peter and Paul both address this in a way that it is a choice on my part to submit myself to this good behavior in front of someone else. Whether it's a good master or a wicked master is not the point. It is a choice of my freedom out of the grace that I've been given to serve well wherever I am. That is an act of freedom. I want you to hear that, because in our culture, often when we hear the word submission, what we hear is you are placed under somebody's fist and ground into nothingness, and you have to make this happen because your boss, your master, that's probably far enough to push that, is making this happen in your life. New Testament doesn't understand it that way. New Testament understands that you are under somebody else and you voluntarily agree to walk alongside them, even to support them, to serve them the best you can, as if you were serving God Almighty himself. That's an act of freedom. It's not being forced to do that. And so when we think about these two choices, either to act rebelliously or to act well, Peter and Paul also will come back to us and say, look, let me give you some reminders here just about why we should act this way. In very tough situations, especially if they're work-oriented and we feel just trapped and we can't get out of them, let me give you sort of some sticky notes of grace here. You can go to the next one. Yeah, you got it up. One is the first thing is this, that to live like this is to find favor with God. And I want to turn that around a little bit, because the Greek text really, it's almost universally translated, find favor. But it could also be translated this way: we bring grace back to God by acting this way. So what happens is we have grace poured out on us, and this kind of behavior, even if it is a difficult situation, when we honor God by honoring our masters, or the ones that we work with, or we honor those around us in a difficult situation, is to take the grace that we've been given and extend it back to God, almost as an offering to him. So that being graced by God, we grace God in return. I don't know if you've ever thought about that. That in that kind of behavior, you are not somehow begrudgingly doing this because you have to. Again, that's subjection. Submission is something else where you choose to do this, and in performing that way, you actually give grace back to God. I want you to let that settle in for just a minute, because it's a different way of thinking about our lives. Here's the example that New Testament always comes to. Don't forget what we have attained by the suffering of Jesus. It is foundational for everything that we do in our lives. Every relationship that we have is based on what Jesus did in this cross. It is based on him giving up his divinity, as Paul says, taking on the form of a slave, a doulos, and not counting equality with God something to be grasped and held on to. That's Philippians 2. And so that becomes our example of how we live our lives out in very harsh, real situations of life. That we once again encounter the suffering that Christ went through for us and adopt that as a way of dealing with the very difficult places that we live in ourselves. So one of the things here that I think that you might want to remember here is that the alternative to this, if you want to take a big sticky note and put it on your head, go ahead to the next slide, is this. The alternative is to wander around like a lost sheep. Where is he anyway? Huh? Where's the sheep? The lamb? Oh, he's over here. Okay. He's sleeping. Okay, great. Whenever you do animal experiments in church, you never know what's going to happen. It's never sure. And so, but I brought the lamb on, obviously on purpose. Just accidentally jumped in the back of the car and I brought him on just for fun. I want you to think about, and I'm interested in some of your reactions here to the lamb in your presence, both before he got out of the cage and after. So the kids went immediately to the lamb and wanted to pet it back in the cage and stuff. What else? Where's our worship leader? Where'd you go? Where is she? Oh, she's hiding. Yeah. She said, if that lamb comes up on the stage, I'm going to crack up right in the middle of worship. And sure enough, right up on the stage it went. What else took place with that lamb wandering around in here? What'd you notice? How many of you knew there was a lamb here before I just said that? Okay. How many of you didn't? Let's do it this way. How many of you didn't know there was a lamb here? Oh, okay. So what was taking place when the lamb was wandering around? Distraction, okay. What else? What was going on in your brain? What kind of crazy person brings a lamb to 22nd Street Baptist Church? To eat the wires? Yeah. If it was a goat, I would have got him down, but lambs are safer than goats, so. What else? What else occurred to you? Anything? What did you think about as the lamb wandered around and we could have a sheep as a pet. So marital counseling 101 right after church. What else? What struck you? It was distracting to an extent. It draw your attention, wondering where he went. And I'm amazed he's finally settled down over there. Is Alex petting him? Is that what's going on? Yeah, okay. Yeah, the lamb doesn't have any. He's wandering around up on top. He walked under the chairs. He was bumping into people, that kind of thing. Well, and I want you to think about that image for just a minute, because if we forget the cost for our presence with God, if even for a moment we forget what God has done in Jesus for us, we can real quickly become just like that lamb again, wandering around aimlessly. I mean, they are not bright creatures. Let's just put it, sheep are really dumb. And I don't know if those of you who petted him, I mean, you think, oh, nice little woolly lamb, he's going to be so soft and cuddly. And his coat is really coarse and it's dirty. It's just nasty, to be quite honest. And that's because they live in the dirt. They don't live, in nice houses like this. And so if that's a projection, if that's a picture of who we are without the grace of God, for us that should be a constant reminder of what God has done for us in Jesus. And if he has done that for us in our relationship with him, when we were sheep wandering around with no sense of where we were headed, isn't that sort of a sticky note to put on the top of our heads here and say, man, I'm going to remind myself every day about this incredible gift of grace and how I can then be the conduit for that same kind of grace. Now, in two directions. One, I'm going to give it back to God. Secondly, I'm going to be the conduit to have others experience that same grace that I've experienced. That's what Peter's talking about here. That by doing well, you will silence the ignorant ones, but also that you will draw them towards this relationship with God that you have been graced with. That's the whole purpose. That's where we're all called to live our lives. In whatever setting we are, whether we are the chief executive officer of Nike and wanted to move a whole operation to Tucson to support the University of Arizona instead of Oregon, which would be a really good thing this week, as far as I'm concerned. Or if we are, if I'm a dishwasher at Wendy's, if I'm the guy who just started, I don't have any other place to go right now, and I'm going to make this as honorable a job as I can, and I've got the worst boss in the world. He's 2 years out of high school, and he's never paid attention to anybody else in his life but himself. And he's my boss. I've got a PhD in Old Testament, and I'm washing dishes at Wendy's. That's happened before, believe me. I'm going to try, out of my experience with Christ, to be the very aroma of God himself in that setting. I don't know if you ever saw the old movie No Time for Sergeants from the 50s, I think it was made. Anybody ever seen that movie? No? Who was the Mayberry sheriff? Andy Griffith. He was in No Time for Sergeants. Came out of the hills of Tennessee, I think, if I remember the movie correctly, and he was sort of a clod. And he had this horrible sergeant who gave him the worst jobs possible, which at that point in the movie was cleaning the latrines, the inside plumbing. And he took that on as this incredible place of doing a good job. And the story opens and it shows the latrine area in a barracks, and it's just foul. It's just gross. And he takes this job on, and then he proudly shows his sergeant what he's done. And the latrine was like 15 sort of outhouse seats in a row with no dividers between them. And he had rigged it up so he could lift them all up with one lever. And so they go all up at the same time. And then he showed him how he brought in one big washing thing and had cleaned it sparkling clean. Then he would let it back down and clean all the seats up again together. And it became this huge joke, but it was for me, I saw this movie a really long time ago, and it's still a lasting impression for me of someone who models what Peter's talking about. Even if you have a bad, wicked, twisted boss and you have a really tough position, there is a way to do this well and to honor God who is behind it. So go ahead to the next slide if you would. This is a phrase that I've adopted over the last year for our church family. How then shall we live? There are places in our lives when we forget grace. I mean, we all do it at some point. We get so tied up with our lives of work and home and children and even sometimes church that we forget grace. We think somehow we've deserved this good life that we have. Worked hard for it, spent 27 years in school. That's really sad for me to say that, but that's how long I was in school, 27 years. And I usually tell people it just took me longer to get what you could have gotten a lot quicker, but it is, and we can sit on those laurels and forget that God Almighty has given himself for us through grace. This passage constantly brings us back to remember that we were like sheep gone astray and that we need a shepherd to lift us and to hold us. Don't ever forget the foundation of grace in your life, ever. If you forget it, you will become like the wicked master, the twisted one, who comes at things sideways and affects everyone around you negatively. The second thing is this, sometimes life is just tough. There are things that come up in our lives that we cannot escape from, no matter how hard we try. Maybe it's economically, maybe it's something that's emotional, maybe it is something that has happened in your life that is physical. You have a physical illness that you cannot get away from. And it is important for us to be real about that and to recognize that there are some things that we cannot just escape from. And in the face of that, how we deal with that is a reflection of how much we understand about this grace thing. I've worked with people who have been touched deeply by God's grace in my life. Many of them have had profound effect on me and made me a much better man than I would have been without them. Others have had that same experience of grace. And someplace along the line, they forgot what God did for them in Jesus. And they've made my life miserable and everyone else around them miserable because they came to this place where they thought that they deserved what God had given them. And so part of this reality is to really think about when we live in tough places is to fall back on what Peter said here. Christ died for us. He suffered loss for us, that we might not be like lost sheep. Destiny, could you go back there and rob Junior Lamb from Alex and just remember how you had him when I picked you up at the house? Destiny's my helper. Thank you very much, Destiny, for bringing the lamb here. I'm almost afraid to wake up the lamb, but we'll do it anyway. Destiny didn't know that I was going to ask her to come up here on the stage, so. You bring him up here, Destiny? Bring him up here. Any of you guys know Isaiah 40, verse 11? Off the top of your heart? Okay. It says something like this. He will be like a shepherd to the lost ones, and he will wrap up the lambs to his breast and carry them. That's the sequence in this passage. That when we were wandering around like lost sheep, had no clue, and we can be so distracting to others when we are sheep like that. Exactly the same thing that happened with the sheep, with this lamb here, wandering up on the stage and bah, bah, during the worship time and all that kind of stuff. When we are out there on our own, outside the boundaries of grace, we can be so distracting to other people who are searching for God. We can really get in the way of others. This passage suggests that in whatever situation we are asked to remember that God lifts us up like a lamb to his chest and holds us when we can't do it ourselves. That we, as Peter said, let me read it to you again. You were lost sheep with no idea who you were, where you were going. Now you're named, this is Junior, and kept for good by the shepherd of your souls. That's the foundation for how we live in the aroma of Christ in whatever situation we find ourselves. It is also the foundation for choosing to live that way in freedom. It is the freedom of grace, and it is the insanity of Christianity. But it's the place of life.